to Scottish Independence Podcast. We're only a few weeks now before the Holyrood election, and this is another one of our Countdown to Holyrood podcasts. And today our guest is Laura Moodie, who is standing for Scottish Greens. She's standing in the south of Scotland region. We met up with her the other week and had a really, really good chat. I really enjoyed it.
So did I. When you hear it, you'll be so impressed with how many topics we managed to cover, including some works of literature that tie in with railway lines. It was a very interesting conversation.
Yes, if you're a Dorothy L. Sayers fan, you'll like that bit.
Because we're moving into this Holyrood period of intense interest and things happening, we're going to be moving to 2 podcasts a week. So anyway, this is the first. We'll just go over and join Laura.
Laura, thanks so much for coming on. Really nice to have you with us again. And also great to know that you're standing on the regional list, South of Scotland regional list for the Scottish Green Party. So want to hear a bit more about that and how you're getting on with it. So I follow you on Instagram. So I see your posts and I sort of go, oh, you're in Galashiels one day and Langham another day. And I did think, wow, you're really clocking up the miles as you campaign. So you're obviously busy. Is it going well?
Yeah, it's going really well. Because we're a smaller party and we don't have the money of the other parties, we rely a lot on ground campaigning. And this is the first campaign I've done where absolutely every branch is out there chapping doors, throwing all they can at it. So that's been really exciting to see. But also we campaign all the time. So, the first day of this campaign was the day after the count for the last Holyrood campaign. So it's sort of stepping up gears and it's been really great. Now the election is really on everybody's radar. You can absolutely see that sort of skyrocketing enthusiasm. And this coming weekend, for the first time, we'll have people out and about in absolutely every branch that's in the region. So I had to do a little video to say where they all were, and the hard part was memorising all the places. Lochmaven, Innerleithen, Duns, Craven, Pennycook, the everywhere, which is really great to see. And it's fantastic to see the enthusiasm and the numbers of folk that are turning out for us. It's slightly confusing, but we've had quite a big boundary change for South Scotland. So I was a candidate in 2021, and then we did a lot of campaigning in East Lothian, and now East Lothian isn't in the region at all, but South Lanarkshire all the way up to East Kilbride is. So it's a massive area to try and cover.
Yeah, well, hugely different in terms of its makeup as well, the type of communities.
You've got big towns like Ayr, Kilmarnock, Dumfries, and then you've got the sort of more rural communities as well.
How do you adapt to those differences?
Well, this is the big advantage of having branches in every region. So I really rely heavily on those branches and those local members telling me what's going on the ground locally. It's a bit of a tricky one because everybody likes the idea of having a local candidate, but obviously for a South Scotland region that covers such a big landmass, you can't be local to everybody. But what you can do is try and be aware of the differences between different areas and what local priorities are. But to be honest, in this campaign, the big priority I think everybody has is the cost of living. And so that is something anyone anywhere in Scotland can understand. Transport's a big issue across the south, and that's something I've campaigned on a lot. And then people just looking for things to improve the climate and environment, really make progress on that, because it feels like we've gone backwards a bit, or certainly stalled over the last couple of years, when we really need to be stepping up progress.
Yeah. I mean, it's just really interesting, but it's good to kind of get a sense of those overarching ones. I mean, as you say, people campaigning in Glasgow are probably going to come up against those same issues, cost of living and what have you. But the one about transport's interesting. I mean, I saw what you said on Instagram about reinstating those railway lines. And because as it happens, a couple of years back, we had a week's holiday down. It wasn't in Stranraer, it was near Stranraer. I've never been to that part of Scotland before. I was partly aware of, it's quite a long way down, isn't it? You referred in one of the posts to one of Dorothy L. Sayers' books, I'd read it not that long ago. I read it, and I'm a fan of hers, but I'd never read that one before. And I was really aware of all the train journeys that were happening, and I was even getting to the point of getting a map out to find out where these people were going and who might be, the murderer and who might not be. But I mean, if that could come about, I mean, obviously it'd be a long-term project to get it going. But the new railway from Edinburgh south down to Galashiels, is it? I mean, that's been so successful, so it'd be fantastic.
Yeah, every rail reopening project that has happened in Scotland has massively exceeded expectations in terms of user numbers. And so you're like, well, let's do more of that. We know that every pound that we spend investing in the railways brings back at least £2.50 into the economy. So, that's a good return on investment. So we should be doing more of that. We've seen the massive success there's been with Borders Rail, with other reopening projects. We had the Leven line recently reopened, the Bathgate Airdrie link between Edinburgh and Glasgow.
The Alloa line, local to me, that's transformed Clackmannanshire.
They make such a massive difference to local communities, far more so, in my view, than road building projects, which are often just more of the same, building the same thing bigger. And road building is a lot more expensive and a lot more disruptive. So I've been campaigning on the Dumfries Strand for a long time now, and there are other rail reopenings in South and other rail investments in South that we need to see. Electrification still hasn't got throughout the south of Scotland. They've just started electrifying the Borders line. So there's quite a few projects that could be done, but I've gone from an area where literally in the 1930s there was a book whose entire plot depends.
Yes, exactly.
Spoiler to anybody reading it. Entire plot depends on the fact that there's not one but two different ways you can get from where I live to Glasgow for a mid-morning meeting. Now the area I live in is just about one of the furthest in the whole of Scotland from the rail network. So if I want to get a train, I have to do at least a 45-minute journey to Stranraer or Dumfries. If I want a quickish train, I need to get all the way over to Lockerbie to get the West Coast Main Line. So, that's just for generations that change has happened. And there's no need for that. There was always demand for that line. And I think that demand is really growing and it could make a massive difference. I think, we're on the same page in terms of independence. So one of the things I'm looking closely at is how we can build a rail system that enables us to act as an independent country, because at the moment quite a lot of my railway journeys would involve me going down to England to then get back up north. And one of the things if we extended the Borders line and if we reopened the Dumfries Stranraer line, particularly if we followed a very specific route that I won't go into detail, it would for the first time enable a cross-country rail route from Edinburgh, Rosyth, the ports up there, to Stranraer, Cairn Ryan, which would give us that crucial through route for freight between European hubs, between Scandinavia and Ireland via Scotland, without going into England.
Yeah.
So for me, there's a real, if we're serious about building an independent Scotland, we need to be thinking seriously about these kind of infrastructure projects that wean us off reliance on English or UK infrastructure.
That's a really interesting point, actually. And it's one that's come up quite a bit recently in discussions we've had. The most recent one was to do with the Scottish Government bonds issue. There's nothing built into that for, well, what if there's an independence event happens during the lifetime of this bond, even as a sort of impact assessment. So delighted to hear you're looking at that. I mean, it's really quite good timing, I think, for the Greens this year. I hope you're finding that out and about, because the thing that struck me with the success of Zach Polanski and the profile of the Greens in England and winning that by-election, there's sort of more visibility than ever before. But also, if there was ever a time to think we shouldn't be reliant on fossil fuels, it's at a time when the world has been held hostage by whether they can move oil up and down the Straits of Hormuz. I mean, surely that must be a gift to you guys in terms of campaigning.
Yeah, so you can see behind me, I've got my more wind, more peace poster, because it's true. We have this huge renewable energy resource. If we tap into that and make the most of that and make sure the profits from that are coming to communities in Scotland, that is our most stable and secure, and also the cheapest. And at the moment, we are hugely at risk from these price shocks, which are happening more frequently anyway, because we've got a mature basin and there's less, it's a finite resource, however big that finite resource might be. And obviously the world is becoming increasingly volatile. We can have true, genuine energy security in Scotland, but it is going to take a huge amount of investment, and it is going to take real commitment to making sure that that money and the benefits of that are felt by local communities. At the moment, we still have quite an extractive model in our development for renewables, where we have big multinational companies come in, they build this infrastructure, most of the profits are getting sucked out and going straight back overseas. We need to build a model where more of that money is captured, not just for the exchequer, but also for the local communities that are hosting this infrastructure. Other countries have managed that. There's no reason we can't do it, but it is going to take a lot of quite smart, careful thinking, because obviously we're in this area where part of the energy system is reserved, a big chunk of it, part of it is devolved. So not everything we would ideally want to do is in the gift of the Scottish Parliament, but that doesn't mean to give up and not take the actions that we can make. The Greens have always been about being bolder and trying to really push at the limits of devolution, and sometimes we get unstuck with that. We saw that in this Parliament with DRS and the gender recognition reforms, but I'd rather us push and go as far as we can and force the UK government into taking a no you canna stance than be far too mild, because I don't think we serve the Scottish public very well if we are not being bold with and trying to do the most we can with the powers that we already have.
I think that's such a smart sort of move. I mean, particularly the deposit return scheme, it infuriates me every time I see a can lying on the pavement. I think, and I personally curse Alistair Jack to the gods, every day.
So frustrating. I mean, it is speaking, obviously we've had the very, very long court case, and I don't think there's going to be an appeal, but you never know. But that whole thing was so avoidable and so frustrating. And it had been such a long time coming, and we were so close. And for what? It's all been kicked into the long grass. We're now even further behind our European neighbours, and the litter problem is only getting worse, and councils are only more stretched trying to deal with it. Immensely frustrating.
Every time Fiona goes on holiday, she was on holiday in Finland recently, and then in Norway, and I get photographs back of, look, this is how they do the recycling, and you put the thing in there, and then they give you a token, and then I can go and spend it. And it's just it was so disappointing, and it just seemed to be, I don't know, revenge almost, and
which was frustrating because it was something that all the parties had agreed to. It was agreed way back in before the last election. So I find it incredibly disheartening and quite disingenuous when kind of party politicking comes into these things, when you're like, well, there was consensus here, why isn't there? There should be a way to resolve these things, but clearly in that case there just wasn't. There was no moving past the block that they eventually used to stop.
Yeah, and I think having Edward Mount in charge of the Net Zero Committee at the time it was being discussed was a barrier before you even start. He was talking about, but what about this poor, I forget what company it was, big drinks company, they're going to have to put labelling on all the bottles. And I think that is a pan-European country. They do that in every other country in Europe. Why would it be a problem in this one? But can I just ask you then, that point about pushing the boundaries of devolution, which I am absolutely in favour of, do you have another couple of examples? Because there's a sort of little gap, I think, between the government saying this is as much as we can do because we're devolved, and the Greens saying you're not using all the powers you've got. In fact, Labour say that as well, don't they? What are things in that gap you think that could be more progress being made on that currently is not happening?
Certainly there's a lot on community energy that I think we could do more of. There's a lot of technical detail behind there, and it's acronyms, and but there is more definitely that we can do with the powers we have in terms of tackling climate and nature emergencies. Also being a bit bolder with long-term funding. So obviously we have the challenge that the Scottish Government gets its block grant set every year. So it's very hard to do multi-year funding. But I think we really are getting to a point where we need to bite the bullet and find smart ways, perhaps using the investment bank or other tools, maybe sort of insurance-y type schemes almost being set up, so that we can give people at the end the surety of ongoing multi-year funding. I live in a rural area, and for me, that's going to be something that's really critical for farmers and agriculture. We know that we need to make this shift, and we've set up through the recent Agriculture and Rural Communities Bill the sort of framework for legislation of moving to more nature-friendly farming. But for farmers to have the confidence to make that switch, we really need to be giving them the confidence that they're going to get funds every year, and that funding is going to change to encourage them to move to the more regenerative practices that we really want to see farmers move to. So it's that sort of being nimble and thinking about different ways that we can approach the problem, because the status quo can't really hold. We actually saw a little bit yesterday. There was a very interesting article on BBC News website actually about the assisted dying legislation. And unusually for the BBC, there was an acknowledgement at the end of that article about the fact that that piece of legislation, had it passed, was another area where you were really pushing at the limits of devolution. Yeah. They'd had to sort of get various assurances from the UK government that they'd allow sort of reserved powers to be devolved to the Scottish Parliament to enact that legislation if it was passed. I mean, in the end, it wasn't passed, but you could see that there was real tension there at various points.
Yeah, I was watching some of the debate yesterday, actually, and some of the MSPs did mention, I would have voted for this if it wasn't for this particular point to do with safeguards and things. And they were blaming the limits of devolution for not being able to fill those. And then one of them actually said, of course, we might be able to revisit this when England passes its legislation. What's the point, of having our own parliament when that's...
Well, yeah, and there's absolutely no... I mean, and essentially the English legislation has ground to a halt in the Lords. Yeah. That is going to be timed out. It's not going to make the progress. So, it is hugely frustrating, because there is the opportunity there sometimes for Scotland to lead the way on things.
I was disappointed with that result yesterday from the assisted dying bill. I was hoping that it was going to go through. However, that was the third go, and we can come back and, another go. And
every time Parliament has looked at it,
yes,
the margin has got smaller. And I mean, likewise, my mum died a couple of years ago, and it was an honour to care for her in the last few days, but she died of blood cancer, and it's a very difficult disease in its final stages. And having seen that and had that experience, I feel quite strongly that there should have been a better option for her in her final days. And I think, likewise, I can completely understand the concerns of disability activists, particularly about the concern that this could lead to people feeling coerced and forced into it. I felt the legislation yesterday had just about got that right balance. A lot of work and energy and effort had gone into trying to get it to a place where I think that's why that gap had narrowed. It had provided a lot of reassurances that people needed. But just not quite enough.
Not quite enough. And I mean, I think Liam MacArthur just deserves huge amount of thanks, actually, and praise for the amount of effort he's put in, but also just the way he conducted himself. And I think then that kind of fed into it just being a very good debate.
Yeah, and the Scottish Parliament can do that marvellously. I mean, I obviously... very interested in the buffer zones legislation that Gillian Mackay brought through in her first term, and that had the potential to be an incredibly divisive, contentious, fraught piece of legislation, but the way she handled it and the approach she took to it was fantastic. And actually, in the end, it passed very, very comfortably, and actually was relatively uncontentious because of the approach, the sort of collegiate, positive approach that had been taken.
I think that's an aspect of Holyrood that just doesn't get reflected fairly in the mainstream media. I mean, well, there's a lot of things that don't get reflected fairly in the mainstream media, but usually they're to do with the independence and constitutional kind of matters. But actually, I think that's another thing that just people don't kind of pick up on, the fact that there's a lot of overlap and there is a lot of working together. And then of course there's there's First Minister's questions, which has got more and more kind of antagonistic in a way
It's
that
just attack the First Minister, isn't it?
Yeah, it just didn't used to happen. Well, it did happen, but it was a bit more friendly somewhere.
It's really interesting. So the Scottish Parliament has always been designed to be multi-party democracy, people working together. But our press and our media are still very much looking at it through a Westminster kind of lens. And it's really frustrating because then it feeds into, it perpetuates it, because the parties know that what gets the headline is the gotcha question at FMQs, not the quiet, patient, behind the scenes, diligent work, which is actually what you need to make good legislation that will work.
What you often see in the committees as well is much more, having just dissed the net zero one, often what goes on in committees is really collegiate and constructive. Is it disappointing then that you've then got John Swinney's current, you can be independent if it's both votes SNP and an SNP majority, because that is leaning into the Westminster style first past the post system, which I personally think is disrespectful of a PR parliament, but it's also disrespectful of other pro-indie parties such as yourself. Is that a big issue in the Greens or not?
It is counterproductive. I would say every party is going to go into every election wanting every vote for themselves, obviously. So on that basis, both votes SNP, fine. Obviously. I think the problem I have is when people are trying to claim that position is some sort of clever gaming or master strategy. And it's like, well, no, it's not. It's just trying to get every vote for yourself. I think particularly in this election, this is a high stakes election because this is the election we are almost definitely going to see Reform getting in. Yeah. And we know from the polls that Reform are really are going to get their seats from the list. All the polls recently are showing the SNP getting a lot of constituency seats because although their vote share has fallen, as you would expect after 20 years in government, the vote shares of their competitors, main competitors, Tory and Labour, have cratered. And the Tory and Labour vote is going to Reform. So the SNP are going to shoot up the middle in most seats. The exceptions actually are the few seats where they're up against Lib Dems or Greens as the next alternative. So because of that, they're going to end up being massively overrepresented just by their constituency seats. So they're even more unlikely than previous elections to get people on the list. So they only got one list MSP last time, I think. And that took 127,000 votes to get in. That's a lot of votes. And there were 750,000 SNP list votes that didn't elect anybody at all. Now, if you are all in for the SNP, you vote for them on both lists. But my big concern this time round is that Reform's pathway into Parliament is going to be smoothly laid out for them by a yellow brick road of SNP list votes. And the way to stop that is to vote for the parties on the list. Now, obviously, I'm going to say vote Green. But you know what? Even if you don't like the Greens, even if that is not your independence isn't your priority, the environment isn't your priority, whatever, you should be looking at other parties in the SNP for that list if you want to stop Reform. And that's the only way it's going to be achieved. Now, it could be that John Swinney is looking at the next election and thinking, well, it'd be quite nice to face Malcolm Offord over the dispatch box because he's inexperienced, Reform are going to be chaotic and incapable. That's going to lead for an easy ride. But that is not going to help the country. And that is not going to help any of us to have that level of chaos happening in Parliament. And I think, there's got to be a decision made. And I think a lot of voters are making this decision. It's certainly, when I'm speaking to people on the doorsteps, I know it's total cliche, but more people's votes are up for grabs than ever before. A lot of people have still not decided. Now, some of those people might well end up voting for Reform, but a lot of them are asking for, well, what's the best way to stop Reform? And so, we're having those conversations. Obviously, the Greens have been helped a lot by the Gorton and Denson by-election down south, which has really demonstrated that, yes, you want to stop Reform, you can vote for the opposite of Reform and vote for the Greens, and that will work. And that is very clearly the case across Scotland. We are very well placed to get people in on the list across Scotland. But wherever you are, whatever your priorities are, just think really carefully when you're casting your list vote, because it could make a real difference to the outcome. Even if you're not casting that vote for reform, you could be helping usher them in.
It's a very telling image, that, actually, the reform getting in using the SNP yellow brick road. Actually, I mean, Fiona and I did a podcast a few weeks back. We called it Holyrood Majority Rules ? Because we are still both of the mind that Mr. Swinney, I mean, I can understand him or anyone, in SNP. Of course, you just want people to vote for your party. Much easier to run the country if you're the majority government and you don't have to rely on those pesky Green people, or the Labour Party. Of course, you can understand that. But where we kind of parted company with them was the argument that because there was a majority of SNP in 2012, and that was the reason why a Section 30 was agreed and the referendum was set up. I mean, I just think that's plain not correct. I mean, it was one of the factors. I mean, it was an important factor, but it wasn't the only factor. I mean, a big factor was that support for independence was running at about 25%, and Mr. Cameron probably thought, oh, let's just give them it, and that'll be that off the books for another generation, probably, although he didn't say that. So we kind of think, or we're hoping that, I mean, if they get a majority, fine, but we're kind of hoping he hasn't shot himself in the foot with that one, because you can imagine the unionist commentators, if there isn't an SNP majority, are going to say, oh, well, you said that was what you needed, you haven't got it.
It's a gift. It is a gift to critics. Also, Keir Starmer has come out clearly and said, even if they do get a majority, we're not granting it. So, I mean, from our perspective, we're like, well, maybe there'll be Greens in a position of power in England and Wales come 2029, who also support Scottish independence, and we might be in quite a good position if there's a lot of Greens in the Scottish Parliament to encourage them to make a new independence referendum a condition of support. I think the problem with all of what I've just said and all that John Swinney said is that all of that focuses on process. And I feel ever since 2014, we have been very bogged down in the independence movement in talking about process. And what we actually need to do is be building the case to persuade more people that an independent Scotland is what they want. Yeah. And I don't think we've done that so well. So that's why things like, my example of the railway line, we need to be doing things like that. We need to be showing, not telling, that we are building a viable, independent country. And we can do that from a position of making the most of our devolved powers. But unless we do that, we're not going to bring enough people with us. And the way we will get another independence referendum ultimately is by there being a sustained majority in favour of it in the population. And we're not there yet. We want to get to that stage where comfortably 60% of people are feeling that they would like to be an independent country, and that's a hard slog persuading those few people over. But that's the way to do it.
Yeah, but you need to watch that as well, because then you get 59.5. Then you've not got your 60%. I do like that idea though of we ought to be making progress towards it within what we can do. I mean, we spoke a couple of episodes ago about independence by to-do list. Because there's a list of things we would need to have in place in order to be a successful independent country. And if we had some sense of, well, that's where we're making progress, then all the time you're closing the gap so that when we actually do get there, it's an easier ride.
And there's some helpful international examples coming up as well. So Iceland's having a referendum in August on EU membership, and I think that is probably going to be the closest and sort of analogous nation we can imagine for how an independent Scotland might approach it. So if Iceland was to vote to join the EU, then the track that they would follow and the time it takes and the process they undertake is going to be very similar to whatever a potential Scottish independent country would take if we wish to join the EU. So that could potentially be quite helpful to Scotland to sort of model a transition and what does it actually look like if a sort of functioning country, a well-established democracy was to join the EU, how long does it take? What do they need to do? What boxes are they having to tick?
Because they have their own currency, so they are areas where they're ahead of us by virtue of being independent. But in terms of process,
it's a good example for us, isn't it? Because of Iceland being in EFTA at the moment. And although, I mean, Fiona and I's friends who are members of Yes for EU group, they tell us that actually on their stalls, no one ever asks about EFTA. They all ask them about the EU, and you have a conversation about what happens, and the EU immediately offer an agreement, kind of trade agreement kind of things for anyone they're talking to about joining. So, but there is still a lot of, well, maybe it's louder.
I think there's a small, loud group.
Small and loud kind of group of, Yes supporters who immediately will come out and go for EFTA. I'm not saying there's not a reason. There's something there to think about. But if Iceland starts talking up to about the EU, about joining, then that's one. That only leaves. Well, Switzerland and Liechtenstein are both very. Well, Switzerland's not quite so small, but they're very particular kind of countries, and they're very particular, arrangements that they have with the EU. That just leaves Norway. And I was reading the other day, like Norway is the closest you can get to being in the EU without actually being in the EU. And I mean, I had an EU commentator sort of saying, well, if Norway was to ask, it might only take a few weeks to talk to them about joining, because they're also close to it anyway. So,
if Iceland did opt to join the EU, how viable is EFTA going to be in the long term as a grouping?
Why would we as a country want to ally ourselves if our only trade party was Liechtenstein? It just doesn't seem to make any sense.
The Scottish Greens have always been very clear that we'd like to be an independent Scotland within the EU, and we would be a moderately sized European country in that wider scale. And prior to this, the only examples of accession countries have really been quite tricky ones that haven't been easy to map over. Obviously, the Balkan states, and post-Yugoslavia and things. And you're like, well, they managed it on quite a curtailed time frame, and that was coming out of a war and all the rest of it.
Exactly.
So that's been a model to look at. But I'm really interested to see what happens with Iceland.
Yeah. So let's look ahead, and there's Laura Moodie, MSP. What are your own interests in terms of what you might want to put effort behind? I mean, obviously there's a transport issue for, not just for the south of Scotland.
Is my big thing. So I'm a bit of a transport geek. So as well as the railways, I'm also chair of a local bus users group. And so I've been working with Better Buses, a sort of national campaign to improve buses. Public transport in my area is terrible / non-existent, and it really needs invested in. It really needs improving. There's no reason why we can't have better bus services in rural areas, and that's been a big thing for the Greens. I'm very jealous of Ariane in Highlands and Islands, and they've got their £2 flat bus fare cap. Which I'm really interested to see what difference that makes, because bus fares in rural areas are no joke. They're really expensive, and that can save quite a lot of money from family budgets. I'm excited about the childcare policies we've announced. Again, being in a rural area, one size fits all childcare doesn't necessarily follow over. So I'm really keen to see that we maybe have some smarter policies for rural communities that look at minimum service kind of guarantees for core things like bus services, like access to GPs and dentists, like childcare, where you can't just roll out funding equally per pupil across the country, because they're just, in rural areas where there's only a few people should be able to still access wraparound childcare, but it's not provided locally because it's almost all delivered via school nurseries and that kind of thing. So quite passionate about it. I've got 4 kids. My oldest has just gone off to uni, so obviously childcare and all things attendance to children are quite important to me. So education obviously is quite key, and especially access to a real range of education for people in rural areas and youngsters in rural areas. And nature, climate. We've got a tiny bit of land, nothing, a field basically, which we've chosen to rewild and restore nature in, but we've raised animals before, and I would like to see much more funding and money coming to local food networks and market gardeners, so we can get more self-reliant for food, not just meat and dairy, which we can produce at scale, but also things like vegetables, and making sure that we're breaking the monopoly of supermarkets so that there's more local supply.
Community benefit
scheme that allows you bill. It'll be interesting to see how that's implemented. So Scotland's the first country to really adapt this into law. The bill itself isn't all that big and detailed, so I think it's open to quite a lot of interpretation. So I'm a bit concerned that some interpretations of it might just mean council procurement methods, which is fine, but I think there is the possibility, there is the kernel in community wealth building, the actual philosophy and the bill, to go much further than that. There was a case in South Scotland not that long ago, a really frustrating one, where there's a brilliant organic dairy in Ayrshire, Bill Burns country, and they used to supply the local schools. Fantastic local organic food delivered in an electric refrigerated truck that went to all the local schools in South Ayrshire, and then the contract came up to be bidded for again, and they missed out because there was a cheaper bidder from one of the big dairy conglomerates. It was cheaper by £6,000. Now the consequence of that dairy losing that contract was having to lay off maybe 10-15 members of staff and sell the van and change. I mean, they've worked around it and have thought on their feet and come up with solutions, but you're like, that sort of thing has to stop. You have to find ways within council procurement policies where you can capture the onward value of something, where, you know, what is the point of saving £6,000 in your council budget if you're immediately laying off people who are going to need £6,000 or more in benefits to tide them over until they get another job? What is the point of not enabling those organisations, those businesses that could thrive, not having the opportunity to grow in favour of big multinational just because it saves a few quid off the bottom line?
The contracting process ought to be able to put some kind of weighting on local.
There's a little bit there, but it's not enough, and it just creates perverse incentives. And makes, you know, encourages the big businesses who can afford to undercut. Yeah. So there are smarter ways of doing it. So the Community Wealth Building Bill has possibilities for there, but it's a bit like the Agriculture and Rural Communities Act. There's lots to happen in this session of Parliament that will underpin that and actually deliver the promises in these big framework pieces of legislation to make them actually happen on the ground. And I'm quite interested in seeing where the potential is to make those have an impact. Yeah,
it sounds like when you're there, let's just make it a when, you've got your work cut out. But so inspiring, kind of hearing someone, and you're talking about, well, let's do that. That's a good principle, but we need to be smart about how we implement that. We need to be nimble about how we into that. And I was really taken earlier when you were talking about, you know, the need for, in some areas, particular, the need for multi-year funding, and that's difficult when you rely on Westminster to tell you only weeks beforehand how much money you're going to have.
There's a lot of joining up the dots, I think, that doesn't always happen or doesn't always get seen to happen in Parliament, and we often have really great bits of legislation but they don't get implemented or they don't get used to their maximum. So I think there's a lot of good work that can be done by just being a bit braver and a bit more diligent in, you know, there's a lot of focus on work on make this amendment, pass this bill, get this legislation over the line, but then what happens once it's there? How many of these tools do we actually pick up and use or think use to make Scotland a better place?
Well, we'll be keeping an eye out to see exactly the answer to that question.
It's just been great talking to you, actually. Really, really appreciated it. Yeah, really, really good. We keep our fingers crossed. You know who we'd be voting for on the list if we lived down there, but unfortunately we don't. So
the best of luck anyway.
Thank you very much. Lovely to speak to you both.
I hope you agree that was a really interesting conversation with Laura. We thoroughly enjoyed it, and we got round a lot of really important topics. We're still going to be focusing on the Greens this week when we've got Ariane Burgess, who is Highlands and Islands. So between Laura on southern Scotland and Ariane on Highlands and Islands, we've got the entire extremes of the country. Nobody can say we're focusing only on the Central Belt. Join us again. Thanks for listening, everybody. Hope you enjoyed that. Don't forget to subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're listening on YouTube, you can click the little bell and you get a reminder whenever we put out a new episode, which is every Friday.
And sign up for our mailing list. You can do that from the website. And we always send one out at the beginning of each month to tell you what's happening. Last but not least, you can buy us a coffee on coffee.com.
And we'll catch you later. Bye now.